I have done a lot of training that involves trauma-informed policing, trauma-informed prosecution, trauma-informed, just under that umbrella of trauma-informed. And I think that it behooves almost every discipline to be trauma-informed. I remember having some dentists at one of my trainings, and they were very appreciative, and they said how they could even see that playing a part, especially because they were seeing a lot of domestic violence and domestic violence victims who are missing teeth, and substance abuse users, especially with meth, and some of the issues there relating to the experience with trauma. I think that the more we talk about it, the more we bring it into mainstream conversations, the better we are, and not only being better practitioners, but better understanding ourselves as well, and our children and our families. Trauma-informed policing, I think, and trauma-informed first responders. That very first step went into often our justice system is so important and has an impact of that perspective throughout the justice system, if you will, a first impression. So making sure that we not only support and train those first responders, but that every other step throughout the justice process, that it is supportive of the recognition of trauma, and that we don't minimize and looking for resources. As a tribal prosecutor, I'm always looking for more resources because they tend to flourish, and then it's at the end of the grant cycle and I have to look for something else. So finding those varied resources for our victims, and also for the defendants and perpetrators, to be able to know that they're part of the community, they're part of someone's family, and that a holistic approach is going to be able to address all of that. So all the way up to our tribal administration, being able to talk to our government and elected leaders to say, look, trauma-informed care, trauma-informed policing, everything under that umbrella of trauma, and knowing when we walk in there to have that conversation that they have experienced, and just making the assumption that there is some level of experienced trauma, so that it's not a difficult conversation. It's not a secret or some dark hidden identity or experience. That the more we talk about these effects and how everyone is different and we have coping mechanisms, the easier I believe it will be to help those within the justice system, but also help the community at large to be able to talk about these and normalize that conversation, so we can have it. That going to seek out counseling or behavioral health is not something that you do in secret. That we all recognize, if I break my arm, I'm going to go to the doctor and get help. If my brain isn't working right or something's a little bit off, I go in to get help with that as well. Just making sure that we better understand ourselves, our community, so that we can better heal ourselves and our community.
Those are really good points about practitioners in the justice system and doing trauma-informed care. I think about some of my clients who've been traumatized by police. And I think about watching videos of arrests and watching my client escalating as they're interacting with officers. And often what happens in our community, the minute the tribal officer arrives, they start to de-escalate because they know that person. It's not a state or county officer, it's somebody they know. And the way that, and the officer knows them, and really just the appearance of the tribal officer, a lot of times I'll just watch them immediately de-escalate, because a lot of that's fear driven. So I just thought I'd comment on that, just building on what Jerry was talking about.
My mind's going in a lot of different directions when we talk about trauma practices, because there's so many different things that we can be doing in everything that we do. I feel like that is really what people have a difficulty kind of grasping, is where to start when we think about starting to implement some practices in the work that we do, because usually we do start with training, and hopefully that training leads to developing a trauma lens. And then once we have that lens, then it's really reverberating through that in all the work that we do, through the policies and procedures that we have, through getting feedback from people. At the end of the day, would those that we serve agree that we are being trauma responsive? And really thinking about and constantly getting feedback from them on how we're doing is really essential to being able to continue and move things forward. An example that I can give is when I was talking circle facilitator, we were doing it in a setting where we put a barrier on the doors so that the women who were there felt safe. And although, survivors of domestic violence felt safe, we got feedback from those who had experienced human trafficking that it actually did the opposite, reminded them of being locked inside, held, held without will. And so we have to think about really tailoring our approach given different experiences that people may have had. And we will never know that without communication, without people feeling like they can give us that information, that we're actively seeking that information so that we can realize the impact of what we're doing, and then respond differently. I mean, that's the whole point of all this, is not continuing to do what we always do, but really changing our own behaviors, our own procedures, and how we operate into what we do into the future.
That's a really helpful example, Megan, from your practice, because I think that when we are not practicing in a trauma-informed way, we can not only be ineffective in what we're doing, right? And not identifying folks' trauma and supporting them adequately and helping them heal, but we can even do harm inadvertently without having some of those conversations. Any advice that any of you might share with other tribal justice practitioners who are hoping to be more trauma informed? What would you recommend that they do? Any advice or stories you might share?
I have a short story about that just happened recently. We have a client who's a young man that had spent a long time in prison and was out struggling fairly soon after he got out with substance use, mental health issues, terrible mental health issues he had. He was one of the people I spoke of that did something terrible that was really traumatizing to him and his family. He finally got to the point where his probation officer was going to revoke him and send him back to prison. And of course, he was avoiding. The attorney working with him was trying to set up a meeting for him to be accountable and go to his probation officer and not avoid, because that was only going to make things worse. He did that with the support of the attorney, who I believe was using trauma-informed practices and really benefiting from our interdisciplinary team that assists us in best practices. And They got through that meeting. He stayed out of prison. But his probation officer said, you need to go to treatment and you need to take the next bed at whatever facility we can get you into. And by the way, that's always very difficult, finding a treatment facility that will take our clients, especially our clients who are struggling with co-occurring issues. A lot of treatment facilities won't take them. But we found a place, and it was a really short notice. One of the treatment facilities in the area called us and said, we have a bed tomorrow. And the attorney brought him into the office. They called the probation officer, said there was a bed available. And he just started to have a terrible response to that. He just started to panic and have huge anxiety, which often turns into anger, and did with him. The attorney was able to calm him down and really negotiate with the probation officer. All he needed was a little bit of time. There was something he needed to do with his family before he left the community to go to treatment. And the probation officer, to his credit, agreed to that and said, okay, we'll put it off. I think they put it off. They didn't know at the time how long it was going to be put off. And it turns out it was just a couple days later, and he went and it was fine. And he went to treatment. Something bad happened after he went to treatment that was traumatic for him, something in his family. And his first reaction was flight. He was thinking about just taking off from treatment. His attorney talked him out of it. And it turned out that was the best thing for him, to stay there, because he got support from the people in the treatment facility. So I thought that was a recent and good example of how all practitioners can do trauma-informed care.
I can also share, because I think that when we think of trauma-informed as a general concept, thinking outside of the box. But I think the interesting thing for me is that there aren't many boxes when we consider Indian country, because it's always a circle. So I was like, think within and beyond the circle, and the answers are there. And the right way to do this is there. We just need to think about it. But with any advice to practitioners, I would absolutely recommend just the training, the multidisciplinary approaches to trauma, recognizing from a victim's perspective what that secondary trauma looks like, but also, very importantly, recognizing how it affects us as practitioners. And they call that vicarious trauma. I know that there was a time a little while back, before I knew more about myself, I was doing a lot of violent crimes, young victims, women, just vulnerable people. And I had one particular case that was a domestic violence, and I had pictures from the crime scene, and I had the victims' photos of the injuries, and I could tell it just didn't move me. And I thought for a split second, I thought, it's not that bad. And when I heard it, I didn't say it out loud, but when I felt myself say that, I knew that I had built up that callus a little bit too much. In my own trauma of trying to protect myself, I built up too much of a barrier. And I thought, if I feel this way and I don't feel that empathy or that fire to say, come on, then I need to back off. So I was able to find somebody to stand in for me. I took a couple of days, I went to a sweat, and I came out, and I knew, and it was a renewed purpose of, what am I here to do? I'm here, I know I'm a good fighter, but I'm a fighter on behalf of victims and on behalf of our Native people. So making sure that as practitioners, you recognize when you've built that up a little bit much and you can't feel the disclosure, when you can't feel what they're talking about, because it's my job to be able to relay that. If I can't feel it, I need to step away for a moment and I need to heal myself, making sure that we're not indestructible, and we're also vulnerable to trauma. So making sure that not only are we taking care of everybody else, we have to take care of ourselves. And we go home and we take care of our children and everybody else in our family. So we need a lot of help. There's a whole lot of people who are wounded, who are traumatized, and they need us. So please take care of yourself so that we can do this work.
Any other advice you'd like to share, lessons learned maybe from your own practice about trauma, other stories?
I just have a kind of a parting thing to say. I believe that as defenders, we have an obligation to tell our clients stories. And that way we're not just cranking cases through the system, but we're working with people as whole members of the community, of the tribal community, and we're working with them in the context of their community. And so we have an obligation to tell our clients stories to the court. And in that way, they're more than just what they're accused of. They're people that most want to do better, and they want to contribute to their community, and some are contributing to the community in some way. So I think we should be able to tell those stories. And if we're at the point that Jerry talked about, that maybe we can't do that anymore and we need to revive, then we should do that. And I also want to speak to judges. I guess it depends on your community and how you view authority and dealing with people who have wronged others, and dealing with people that are committing crimes in your community or accused of committing crimes in your community. I find that people who have experienced trauma, which is most of my clients, and people who are struggling with mental health issues and substance use disorders, aren't going to respond to being humiliated in the courtroom. And I mean, it happens, and it happens all the time, but it's not productive. It doesn't result in someone wanting to do better. What it usually results in is going back to use or avoiding, running, that kind of thing. So that would be my advice, is to have an open mind about the people in front of you and what they're bringing. And of course, it's the person representing them's job to tell you what they're bringing. But I would advise to just be open-minded about and consider that that's also part of trauma-informed practice.
I'll just say that it's easy to lose hope. And I think for us working, we have to maintain the hope, give people hope, and really validate their experience, and then be able to really communicate and be that people can heal from trauma. It is possible. This is why we do this work, is we know, we recognize what the issues are, and no one else can make them, but we can highlight the importance of not addressing trauma. We're very resilient people that we tend to rely on that resiliency, waiting for to see if after we experience trauma, if those symptoms will continue to affect us later on down the road. Yet we can be able to heal from that. We don't have to wait for things to get worse before we address these problems. And as a community, the more that we can provide access to healing, trauma treatment specifically, culturally responsive trauma treatment, particularly if possible, traditional healing, all those things, the more opportunities that we can provide, the better off that we'll be able to continue to heal the community as a whole. And holistically, like Jerry talked about earlier, with not just the individual, but the entire families, and then reverberating that out to community-wide healing.
Thank you for joining us today for this conversation on trauma and implications for tribal justice systems. I'd like to thank my 3 panelists for joining me in this wonderful conversation, and thank you as well for joining us.